Chapter 12 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. Suicide Bombers, the Sacred and the Profane. Introduction. One of the least discussed but most important aspects of the, quote, suicide bombers' attacks is the Anglo-American systematic and profound degradation of that which the Islamic religion holds most sacred: its code of ethics, its mode of spiritual practice, its religious rituals, its sacred texts, and its respect for the observant believer. The neoconservative, liberal, and pro-Israel propagandists, both journalists and academics, focus on what they choose to call the, quote, pathologies of young Muslims, the fanaticism of their beliefs, their gratuitous violence, the generational anger, the frustration of living in, quote, failed states, and a long litany of irrational behaviors which purportedly exonerates the Anglo-American and Israeli violence and torture. A progressive school of thought emphasizes the reciprocal nature of violence, Anglo-American wars, invasions, and occupations, which engender Arab or Islamic terror as part of a spiral of violence. In some versions, the religious element is subordinated to the political concern for self-determination in explaining the behavior of suicide bombers. While the progressive approach has the advantage of advancing beyond the vitriolic psychobabble of the neoconservative and Zionist experts on the Arab mind, it fails to account for the depth and scope of the suicide bomber or martyrdom phenomena, especially the sharpening intensity during the occupation. Beyond the general mayhem induced by Anglo-American wars, invasions, and occupations, there are two forms of violence derivative from the general conception of war, which stand out as the direct determinants of suicide bombing. The Anglo-Americans have theorized and put in practice the idea of total war, a war without legal, moral, geographic, temporal, or spatial boundaries. As Bush, Rumsfeld, and the Pentagon Zionists, Pearl, Wolfowitz, Feith, and Company, declared, this is a different war in which the enemy is everywhere and attacking at all times. The final solution is to search out and destroy them, their sanctuaries, their accomplices, their neighborhoods, families, religious institutions, and any who might offer material or spiritual support, protection, or encouragement. The theory and practice of total war obliterates the distinction between combatants and civilians, between military installations and civilian facilities, between military infrastructure and civilian transport systems, between the sacred and the profane. The Anglo-Americans have imposed new norms of warfare and new practices for engaging the enemy, which have been increasingly taken up by sectors of their adversaries. If Anglo-American imperialism can act with unrestrained violence against all military and civilian targets, so, it can be argued, in recognition of the universality principle, so can the resistance, including the suicide bombers, whether they are Islamists or secular, poor or middle class. What influences the reaction of the adversaries of Anglo-American imperialism are their own rules of engagement, the notion of total war. Total war, content and consequences. There are different forms of imperial conquest. In one variant, the method is to work through local elites who become the tribute collectors and gendarmes of the colonial powers, gaining control of the agro-mineral wealth and financing their privileged position via local taxes. In another variant, the imperial powers destroy the pre-existing society and governing system, frequently uprooting the population and, in the process, physically annihilating its members and culture in the course of seizing its wealth. The degradation of the sacred is a prelude to attempts to impose a new set of beliefs more conducive to submission and exploitation. A third variant is a combination or sequential process of destruction, degradation, and exploitation, followed by efforts to, quote, reconstruct a colonized military, police, and political structure willing and able to repress and contain anti-colonial resistance. The U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan followed the third variant. In the initial phase, the imperial armies engaged in total occupation, unrestrained pillage of historical sites, utter degradation of the population, destruction of cultural institutions, and the systematic assassination of leading members of the local political, civil service, and professional classes. Following the growth of massive resistance by secular and religious forces, uprooted and divorced from their essential everyday living under constant physical and spiritual assaults, the Anglo-American occupation regime moves toward the, quote, reconstruction of a colonial repressive apparatus and governing bodies beyond the walls, barbed wire enclosures, and watchtowers of the colonial army. Total war doctrine continues to wreak havoc with minor concessions to enclaves of collaborators, most of whom are dual citizens, exiles whose loyalties are first and foremost to the empire, whose homes, pensions, and even families, not to mention bank accounts and English rose gardens, are located in the cities of the imperial countries. Total war and the resistance. The practitioners of total war borrow heavily from the practice and doctrine of the Israeli colonial occupation of Palestine. Practices of collective punishment, erasure of historical sites, destruction of homes, eradication of orchards and productive farms, bombing of small factories, building of ghetto enclosures and walls, massive forcible evictions, and especially torture and interrogation techniques designed especially to violate Islamic beliefs and the Arab identity. These techniques have been transmitted via Israeli advisors and training sessions to U.S. interrogators and incorporated into their manuals. It is precisely the common methods of both Israeli and Anglo-U.S. interrogation torture techniques linked to the doctrine of total war, which has led to the common practice of suicide bombers against them. Insofar as the interrogation terror techniques strip their victims of all that is essential to their spiritual self, they also force upon the victims and their sympathizers a new morality, one that no longer abides by the older moral religious precepts, not as it concerns fighting back. Islam is not a pacifist religion. By the Quran, fighting is to be disliked, but it is nonetheless enjoined so long as it is in the way of God, which is further specified as in the way of justice and self-defense, in the way of the widow, the orphan, and the oppressed, but as it concerns the protection of the enemy's innocence. In its place, the new morality is the mirror image of the practitioners of total war. The suicide bombers act without concern for civilians, locations, time, and circumstance. Like their interrogators, they seek to inflict the maximum damage to the Western mind, exposing their weaknesses, increasing their anxieties and fears, while undermining their everyday routines. The key to the conversion of Islamists and the secular opposition to martyrdom attacks and the practice of the new morality is not merely the political, military, colonial occupation and war, but the resort to the specific practices of degradation inflicted on the colonial victim. Degradation, the logic of total war. The Israelis have practiced torture by degradation for decades and have a powerful army of overseas supporters. Professors, neocon, officials, liberals, bankers, professionals, artists, journalists, and media moguls, providing justifications in the form of ameliorating circumstances and moral equivalencies. The Anglo-American practitioners of total war, impressed by the power of Israel to sustain its colonial occupation of Palestine and its impunity, overlooked the negative effects, the suicide bomber phenomenon, and Israel's repugnancy to the non-European world and even to many Europeans. Degradation is specifically designed to break the Arab or Islamic mind, as the Israeli psychological war experts labeled it, and secure an army of informers, agents, and docile, terrorized, released prisoners who would serve as exemplars to other would-be resistance fighters. While a few prisoners were turned through torture and blackmail, and others were released as broken men and women incapacitated by profound psychological disorders, millions reacted not by submission, but with indignation, anger, and violence, which in some cases has taken the form of suicide bombers. The words of the victim survivors of Israeli brutality and visual images provided a terribly graphic reality of the systematic degradation of all the Arabs, Islamists, or secular hold sacred. The perception of the victims, their families, their people, the fellow believers, and their nation is that degradation of Iraqi prisoners is a technique authorized and approved by the highest levels of power and executed by the terror experts, from elite psychologists down to the lowest jailers. Nobody can claim they didn't know. Nobody in a volunteer army can claim they were just obeying orders. Citizens and electoral systems who not only failed to adequately protest the degradation, but actually went on to vote for the imperial executioners post facto cannot claim innocence. All are complicit in the eyes of the suicide bomber. The technique of degradation, the larger meaning. The book of virtuous living for the Islamists and even, to a lesser degree, the secularists among Muslim populations is the Quran. It is the divine book which provides a moral guide and existential meaning to life. The torturers defecated and urinated on the Quran. They stomped on the Quran with muddy boots. They flushed pages, held most sacred by the victims, down the toilet. They violated the most sacred single source of moral life. The torturers systematically denied their victims water to clean themselves before prayer. Instead, they defiled them with filth. Scantily clad female interrogators smeared fake menstrual blood on bound prisoners, forced them to defecate on themselves, and ridiculed their victims' intense religious distress. They violated every taboo, every norm, including the deepest held moral codes. They forced and photographed deviant sex, prolonged nudity, raped men and women with cattle prods and other torture devices. They wrapped prisoners in the Israeli flag. Such humiliating techniques have lifetime psychological consequences, preventing the victims from ever marrying and maintaining normal family relations. The torturers specifically told their victims that the films and photos of their degradation would be shown to their families and neighbors to intensify the anguish after their release. These torture techniques specifically focused on Muslims and Arabs, but in general should be regarded as defiling the sense of modesty of all normal men and women. The torturers used gross sexual humiliation designed to break all political bonds between the colonized people and the degraded victims. Women prisoners in Abu Ghraib reportedly sent out messages begging the resistance to kill them in their cells by mortar attacks. Mosques were destroyed or turned into slaughterhouses. Wounded men huddled in the sacred halls were executed at point-blank range. The Anglo-American political leaders promoted Christian evangelical military chaplains who incited the executioners to fight Satan as they encircled and destroyed the city of Fallujah. Jewish and Christian terror experts, often in the behavior sciences, provided the emotional vitriol in pseudoscientific jargon by projecting the psychopathic behavior of the executioners onto the victims. We need to view the policymakers as war criminals, as formulators of the modus operandi of the suicide bombers. Political consequences of defiling the sacred. The profound systematic effects of total war and its derivative defilement of the sacred has far-reaching effects on Muslims and Arabs, including secularists, in terms of geography, political practice, intensity of reflection, and feeling about the practitioners, their government, and their civilization. The impact of defacing the sacred is strongest on those collectives that share the same ethic, religious, and cultural values as those who are violated. The degradation of the sacred texts and religious sanctuaries impinge on the spiritual and physical existence of the groups and individuals whose lives have been guided by the defiled texts. The message relayed to millions by the torturers and their leaders is that nothing is sacred. Everything and everybody is equally an acceptable instrument for conquest, domination, and control. The whole process of degradation, from the indiscriminate bombing of civilian communities, to the usurpation of public space, to the pillage of a cultural heritage, to the arbitrary arrest and assassination of passerbys, culminates in utter depravity, the attempt to literally turn the spiritual symbols and texts and moral guides into trash. The denial of what is sacred to the oppressed is inherent to the process of creating a hierarchical chain. The greater the degradation of the other, the greater the power and self-esteem of the torturers. The lower the stature of the torturers, those who, outside the torture chambers, have no access to the real spoils of conquests, the war profiteering, the reconstruction racket, or the military officers who can cream the contracts, the greater the inducement to achieve superiority, symbolic rewards, by debasing the shackled and manacled, the naked and the humiliated, to please their superiors with tidbits of irrelevant intelligence. Much of this is documented in General Antonio Taguba's report. The chain of command dictates the license to torture. The word of the imperial executive informs the practitioners of degradation. The celebrants of imperial Judeo-Christian values flaunt their impunity in the security of their technological and military might. The special people, the chosen nations, aggravate the experience of degradation. Imagine Rumsfeld and other officials and senators reviewing General Taguba's report, describing the young son of an Iraqi army officer, stripped, smeared with filth, and abused before his captive father. Seymour Hersh describes the shrieks of young boys being raped and projecting their own perversities onto the victimized people. Suicide bombers, a response to the desecrators. Some of the more intelligent of the generally benighted claimants of expertise in terrorism have discovered that the suicide bombers are not necessarily poor, not necessarily direct victims of imperial invasions, and are not necessarily Islamic fundamentalists. Faced with this incongruence with their earlier depictions, most of them ramp up the complexity of their psychobabble, citing alienation, general conflict, and other behavioral pathologies, strikingly more descriptive of the terror experts' own societies. These Anglo-American and pro-Israeli experts who pathologically ignore the monstrous crimes committed against the essential values and beliefs of the oppressed see themselves, with all solemnity, as actually fit to diagnose the ills of others. A handful of the experts claim that the terrorists, the suicide bombers, are political people, and that these acts are political, a response to the Anglo-American war, invasion, and conquest. Closer to the truth, but still inadequate, some add the response to the humiliation of a conquered people. What drives the suicide bomber is an effort to redeem the sacred from the desecrators. The desecration includes but goes beyond the material destruction inflicted by the Anglo-American invaders and Israeli colonists. Degradation and defilement of the sacred texts, the deep inner values, and the disciplined customs produces a class of individuals who sense the bonds of humanity have been irrevocably broken. The suicide bomber believes that spiritual wrath can counter the desecrators of the sacred. For the future suicide bomber, resistance, marches, protests, strikes, civil disobedience, even resistance in the homeland does not restore the sacred. The conflict rages in their neighborhoods, their houses, markets, and transport. The suicide bomber believes that only by reversing the violence, bring it home to the invaders, will they redeem and reassert the ascendancy of what has been defiled, the sacred, by responding in kind to the total war advocates, apologists, and even to innocent victims, your innocent victims for our innocent victims. Recognition of the licensed defilement of the sacred is now out of the box, whether it continues in one form or another, videoed or hidden in military archives. It is now embedded in the minds of tens of millions. It is their very cultural, psychological, moral existence. Everyday life has been put to the test. Conclusion. From the shock and awe bombing of cities, to the killing, maiming, and destruction of millions, to the torture and profanation of the sacred, the orders have come from distant, faceless generals, presidents, secretaries of war, and have been executed face to face by average people, workers, employees, clerks, who elected these leaders. The many faces of these ordinary people reflect in the eyes of the suicide bomber, the faces and acts of those who have degraded the sacred and attempted to destroy what gives meaning to their everyday life. To the suicide bomber, the face of the enemy is the face of, quote, their people. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, general, and foot soldier. Hence the suicide bomber, whose normal bonds with the sacred and moral have been heightened by systematic degradation, until the suicide bomber feels no compunction in attacking ordinary people going about their everyday tasks in office buildings or subways, enduring personal immolation to reassert the sacred despite the overwhelming power of its desecrators at whatever cost. The victims whose homes, streets, innocents, and dear ones have been bombed and obliterated respond in kind against the homes, streets, innocents, and dear ones of the perpetrators. Our analysis suggests a close relation between the Anglo-American practice of total war and its derivative policies of systematic degradation and the emergence of suicide bombers, one of the ultimate forms of rejection of tyranny. If this analysis is correct, the demise of suicide bombers is most likely to occur when the practice of total war is ended. This can only come about through a defeat of the colonial revivalist strand of imperialism in both its US, European, and Israeli variants. The question is how long it will take for domestic and external political discontent to coalesce a political alternative capable of formulating a strategy of military withdrawal and abiding by international law. Reconciliation between the Anglo-American and Islamic and Arab peoples can be achieved through a war crimes tribunal, similar to the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. The practitioners and proponents of crimes against humanity, beginning with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, should be brought to trial and accorded exemplary punishment to establish a major milestone in civil society's global campaign to end impunity. Peace and reconciliation is only possible if justice is meted out to the architects and practitioners of total war and human degradation.